Imagine being born into the most powerful family on earth, draped in silk, surrounded by gold, destined to rule millions of people, and yet carrying within your very blood a sentence of suffering that no physician, no prayer, and no amount of royal treasure could ever undo. Your children born broken, your heirs wither before they could walk, your dynasty crumbling not from the sword of an enemy, but from something invisible, something inherited, something passed down through generations of carefully arranged marriages that were supposed to strengthen your bloodline, but were, in fact, quietly destroying it. This is not a story of battlefield defeat. This is a story of biology taking its revenge on ambition. For centuries, the royal families of Europe, Asia, and the ancient world operated on a simple and seemingly logical principle. Power must remain within the family. Alliances were sealed not with treaties alone, but with bodies, with daughters exchanged like diplomatic currency, with cousins wed to cousins, with uncles marrying nieces in arrangements that would today be considered not merely scandalous but criminal. The logic was seductive. Keep the bloodline pure. Keep the wealth consolidated. Keep the throne within a circle of trusted kin. It seemed, on the surface, like the smartest possible strategy for dynastic survival. But nature does not negotiate with ambition. And buried deep within the architecture of human heredity lay a mechanism that these royal strategists could not see, could not name, and could not escape. We now call them recessive genes, segments of genetic code that lie dormant and harmless when paired with a healthy dominant counterpart, but that emerge with devastating consequence when two closely related individuals, each carrying the same hidden variant, produce a child together. In a genetically diverse population, the odds of two unrelated people carrying the same recessive mutation are relatively low. But in a family that has been marrying within itself for 5, 6, 7 generations, those odds shift dramatically, catastrophically, and irreversibly. The mechanism is not complicated once you understand it. Every human being carries 2 copies of each gene, one inherited from the mother and one from the father. A recessive gene causes harm only when a person inherits 2 defective copies, one from each parent. If a parent carries only one defective copy alongside one healthy copy, they typically show no symptoms at all. They are carriers, unknowing vessels of a biological time bomb. But when 2 carriers have children, the mathematics become brutal. Each child faces a 1 in 4 chance of inheriting both defective copies and expressing the full, often devastating condition. And when the parents are closely related, the probability of both being carriers of the same mutation rises sharply because they share a common ancestor who passed that mutation down through the family tree. The royal houses of Europe did not know this. The physicians who attended their courts did not know this. The priests who blessed their marriages did not know this. What they observed instead were the symptoms, the hemophilia that made wounds fatal, the jaw deformities that made eating an ordeal, the mental deterioration that emptied brilliant minds, the stillbirths, the infant deaths, the heirs who never lived long enough to inherit. They attributed these tragedies to divine punishment, to bad luck, to the will of God. They searched for explanations in astrology and theology. They never once looked inward at the very custom of dynastic marriage itself, the tradition they had elevated to sacred principle, the practice they believed was their greatest strength. The most powerful families on earth carried a hidden biological curse within their own blood. To understand what happened to Tutankhamun, you must first understand his grandfather. Amenhotep III ruled Egypt at the absolute height of its imperial glory, a pharaoh so confident in his own divinity that he commissioned more statues of himself than almost any ruler before him. He presided over a kingdom of staggering wealth, commanding tribute from Nubia to Syria, building temples of breathtaking scale along the Nile. And yet, within the splendor of his court, Amenhotep III was quietly laying the biological groundwork for a catastrophe that would not fully reveal itself until his grandson lay broken and dying at the age of 19. The evidence preserved in ancient records and confirmed by modern genetic analysis tells a story that is, by any measure, extraordinary. Amenhotep III did not merely marry within the royal family. He married his own daughters. The practice was not unique in the ancient world, but the frequency and the deliberateness with which the 18th dynasty pursued it compressed the genetic diversity of the royal bloodline, with each successive generation. His great royal wife was Tai, a woman of remarkable intelligence and political influence who served as a trusted advisor even after her husband's death. But alongside Tai, Amenhotep III took at least two of his own daughters, Cinnamon and Isis, as additional wives, elevating them to the rank of great royal wife. The theological justification was rooted in the divine nature of the pharaoh himself. A god could not dilute his sacred blood with common humanity. From this compressed bloodline emerged one of the most controversial figures in all of Egyptian history. Amenhotep IV, who would later rename himself Akhenaten, was almost certainly the son of Amenhotep III and Queen Tai. He rose to the throne around 1353 BCE and proceeded to dismantle the entire religious order of Egypt, abolishing the traditional pantheon, closing the temples of Ammonius, and declaring the sun disk Aten to be the sole object of divine worship. Historians have debated for generations whether this religious revolution was genuine spiritual conviction or calculated political strategy to break the power of the Ammonius priesthood. What they have debated far less, until recently, is what Akhenaten looked like and what his body reveals about the dynasty that produced him. The famous artistic representations from his reign show an elongated skull, a protruding jaw, wide hips, and a softness of physical form that ancient Egyptian artistic convention does not typically employ for male rulers. Whether these depictions reflect actual physical reality or a deliberate theological aesthetic remains contested. But the DNA evidence that would emerge from his son's tomb would cast an entirely new light on the question. Akhenaten married his half-sister Nefertiti, or possibly a close female relative of similarly restricted lineage, and from that union came several daughters. But the child who would inherit the throne was born of a different union entirely. The 2010 DNA study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, conducted by a team of Egyptian and international researchers led by Zahi Hawass, analyzed the genetic material of 11 royal mummies spanning 4 generations of the 18th dynasty. The results were staggering. Tutankhamun, who ascended to the throne around 1332 BCE at approximately 8 or 9 years of age, was the son of Akhenaten. His mother was identified as a mummy designated KV35YL, a young woman who was herself the daughter of Amenhotep III and Queen Tai, making her Akhenaten's own sister. Tutankhamun was therefore the product of a sibling union, the most genetically compressed pairing possible between two human beings who share both parents. The consequences were written into every bone of his body. The 2010 study identified that Tutankhamun carried multiple malaria strains simultaneously, suggesting a severely compromised immune system. He suffered from Kolar disease, a condition causing bone death in the foot. He had a clubfoot. He had a cleft palate. He possessed a pronounced overbite consistent with the jaw deformities seen across multiple generations of his family. Now consider what happened next. The 18th dynasty collapsed. The new kingdom eventually crumbled. Egypt passed through centuries of foreign conquest, Persian domination, and fragmentation. And then, in 332 BCE, a young Macedonian general named Alexander the Great marched through the desert, took Egypt without a battle, and handed it to one of his most trusted commanders. That commander was Ptolemy, son of Lagus, and the dynasty he founded would rule Egypt for the next 275 years. What followed was one of the most sustained experiments in deliberate royal inbreeding that the ancient world had ever witnessed. And it would produce consequences that even the most damaged pharaoh of the 18th dynasty might have recognized with grim familiarity. The Ptolemaic dynasty did not stumble into incestuous marriage by accident or theological necessity. They chose it, systematically and repeatedly, as a matter of political strategy. Brother married sister. Uncles married nieces. Cousins married cousins. The practice was partly borrowed from the Egyptian tradition they had inherited, partly justified by the divine precedent of Osiris and Isis, the brother and sister gods of Egyptian mythology. But at its core, it was about power. By keeping marriage within the bloodline, the Ptolemies ensured that no outside dynasty could claim the throne through a royal bride. The crown would remain Ptolemaic, undiluted, uncontested. The logic was elegant. The biological consequences were catastrophic. Across 11 generations, the Ptolemaic family tree did not branch. It folded back upon itself again and again, like a sheet of metal hammered into a tighter and tighter coil. The genetic diversity that protects a population from inherited disease was systematically stripped away. Recessive mutations that might have remained dormant across generations were instead doubled, tripled, expressed with increasing frequency and severity. Historians examining the Ptolemaic record have noted a pattern of mental instability, physical deterioration, and erratic behavior that intensifies as the dynasty progresses. Ptolemy VIII, who ruled in the 2nd century BCE, was described by ancient sources as so grotesquely obese that he required assistance to walk, earning the nickname Physcon, meaning potbelly or bladder. He murdered his own son, married his sister, then married his sister's daughter, and conducted a reign of such spectacular violence that the intellectuals of Alexandria fled the city in mass exile. The genetic and behavioral deterioration was not subtle. It was written in flesh and recorded in blood. By the time the dynasty reached its final generation, the accumulated weight of 275 years of compressed lineage had produced rulers of diminishing capacity and collapsing authority. Egypt, once the wealthiest kingdom in the Mediterranean world, had become a client state of Rome, its kings propped up by Roman military power and Roman financial patronage, its treasury depleted, its population restless. The last several Ptolemaic rulers had ceded effective sovereignty to Rome in exchange for the illusion of continued reign. The dynasty was, in every meaningful sense, dying. And then, in approximately 69 BCE, a child was born into this wreckage. Her name was Cleopatra. She was designated the 7th of that name, and she would become the most consequential ruler the dynasty had ever produced. What makes Cleopatra the 7th so historically extraordinary is not merely what she achieved, but what she overcame to achieve it. She was born into a family whose genetic inheritance was, by any reasonable biological assessment, severely compromised. Her father, Ptolemy XII, known to his contemporaries as elites, meaning the flute player, was a man of such political weakness that he was driven from his own throne by his subjects and had to beg Rome to restore him, paying enormous bribes to Julius Caesar and Pompey to secure Roman support. Her family had spent generations producing rulers who were either violent, unstable, intellectually limited, or all three simultaneously. And yet Cleopatra emerged from this lineage as something the dynasty had not seen in generations, perhaps had never truly seen at all. She was a polymath. What Cleopatra represented was the exception that proved a devastating rule. And nowhere in the ancient or medieval world would that rule assert itself with more catastrophic finality than in the corridors of the Habsburg dynasty, where the most powerful royal house in European history systematically dismantled itself from within, one generation at a time, through the relentless compression of its own bloodline. The Habsburg Empire at its height was staggering in its scope. By the 16th century, the family controlled Spain, Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, the Netherlands, significant portions of Italy, and vast colonial territories stretching across the Americas. Their motto, attributed to the Emperor Frederick III, was AIOU, an acronym for the Latin phrase meaning, "All the world is subject to Austria." It was not mere arrogance. For a time, it was very nearly true. And yet within this colossus of European power, a biological catastrophe was quietly accumulating, compounding with each generation, until it produced two monarchs whose physical and mental conditions rendered the very concept of Habsburg governance a grim historical irony. To understand what happened, you must understand the Habsburg marriage strategy. Unlike the Ptolemies, who confined their marriages within a single family line, the Habsburgs pursued a broader but equally dangerous pattern. They married cousins, nieces, aunts, and relatives of varying degrees, always within the network of Catholic royal houses, always with the explicit goal of consolidating territory and preventing the fracture of dynastic holdings. The result, measured across generations, was a family tree that folded back upon itself with increasing frequency. Geneticists studying the Habsburg lineage have calculated inbreeding coefficients for successive rulers, and the numbers tell a story of accelerating biological compression that no amount of political genius could arrest. The coefficient that defines the end of this story belongs to Charles II of Spain, born in 1661, the last of the Spanish Habsburg line. His inbreeding coefficient has been calculated at 0.254, meaning that approximately 25% of his genetic material was identical by descent. To place that figure in context, the coefficient expected from the union of a brother and sister is 0.25. Charles II of Spain, the sovereign ruler of the most powerful monarchy in the Western world, was genetically equivalent to the offspring of a sibling marriage, and his body bore every consequence of that inheritance. Contemporary accounts describe a man of almost unimaginable physical affliction. He could not chew solid food because his jaw, a characteristic Habsburg deformity that had grown progressively more pronounced across generations, was so severely malformed that his tongue barely fit within his mouth. He suffered from chronic diarrhea, episodic vomiting, and convulsions throughout his life. He did not walk until he was 8 years old. He was not weaned until he was nearly 5. His contemporaries noted that he appeared perpetually dazed, that his speech was difficult to understand, and that his capacity for sustained attention or rational governance was severely limited. He was described by the Countess of Aulnoy, who observed him at the Spanish court, as having a face so long and so disproportionate that it seemed almost theatrical, a living monument to the consequences of dynastic excess. He reigned for 35 years, from 1665 to 1700, largely because he had no alternative and his court had no mechanism to remove him. He married twice. He produced no children. His body, ravaged by the accumulated genetic damage of 11 generations of compressed Habsburg lineage, was simply incapable of sustaining an heir. When physicians examined his corpse following his death in November of 1700, they reportedly found his body to contain not a single drop of blood, his heart the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotten and gangrenous, and his head full of water. Whether these accounts are precise or embellished by the horror of those who witnessed the examination, the underlying biological reality was not in dispute. The death of Charles II of Spain closed one chapter in the long history of dynastic self-destruction. But the story of inherited disease moving through royal bloodlines did not end with the Habsburgs. It simply migrated, carried forward by a different mechanism, through a different family, and toward a catastrophe of an entirely different magnitude. Because while the Habsburgs collapsed under the weight of accumulated recessive traits over 11 generations, the next great genetic disaster in European royal history required only one woman and a single spontaneous mutation to set an empire on the path to ruin. Her name was Alexandrina Victoria, and she was born on the 24th of May, 1819, at Kensington Palace in London. She ascended to the British throne in 1837 at the age of 18, and she would reign for 63 years, becoming the longest-serving British monarch until that record was surpassed by her great-great-granddaughter in 2015. She was, by nearly every measure, a figure of extraordinary historical consequence. She presided over the expansion of the British Empire to its greatest territorial extent. She navigated decades of political transformation with a combination of personal stubbornness and institutional flexibility that kept the monarchy relevant through an era of revolutionary upheaval across the continent. She was, in the language of her age, the grandmother of Europe, a title she earned not merely through sentiment, but through the sheer biological reach of her family. Victoria married her first cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, in February of 1840, and together they produced 9 children. Those 9 children were then married strategically across the royal houses of Europe, binding Britain to Germany, Russia, Spain, Greece, Romania, and beyond through a web of dynastic alliance that was, by the standards of the 19th century, a masterpiece of geopolitical engineering. What Victoria did not know, what no one in her court or her medical establishment could have known, was that she carried within her a mutation in the gene responsible for producing clotting factor IX. The condition it produced was hemophilia B, sometimes called Christmas disease after the first patient in whom it was formally characterized in 1952. It is a disorder in which the blood cannot clot properly, meaning that even minor injuries can produce prolonged, life-threatening bleeding, and that internal hemorrhages can accumulate in joints and organs with devastating and agonizing effect. The mutation Victoria carried was almost certainly spontaneous, meaning it arose in her own genetic material rather than being inherited from either of her parents. Neither her father, the Duke of Kent, nor her mother, the Duchess of Kent, showed any evidence of the condition. Victoria herself was a carrier, meaning she bore one functional copy of the gene and one defective copy. As a female carrier, she experienced no symptoms. But her sons had a 50% chance of inheriting the defective copy and developing the disease, and her daughters had a 50% chance of becoming carriers themselves, capable of passing the mutation to the next generation without ever suffering its effects. Of Victoria's 9 children, at least 3 daughters became carriers, and at least one son, Leopold, Duke of Albany, developed hemophilia B directly. Leopold died in 1884 at the age of 30, following a fall that triggered a cerebral hemorrhage his blood could not contain. His death was a private tragedy. The deaths his sister's bloodlines would eventually enable were something far more consequential. Victoria's daughter Alice married Ludwig IV, Grand Duke of Hesse, and passed the mutation to her own daughter Alex of Hesse. That young woman, raised in the German Principality, deeply religious, intensely private, and possessed of a will that those around her frequently described as iron, would travel to Russia in 1894 to marry the heir to the Romanov throne. She converted to Russian Orthodoxy, took the name Alexandra Fyodorovna, and became Empress of Russia upon the death of Alexander III in November of that same year. Her husband was Nicholas II, the last Tsar of the Russian Empire.